Simon, welcome to the podcast, mate. How are you doing?
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Mate, I've been looking forward to having you on since I stumbled across an article about you. I can't remember. I think it might have been when I was researching for Frank's episode. I think I might have come across it, and I was kind of like, oh, this is disappointing because it sounded like a great book was coming out, and then there was some, and then it wasn't. I was like, well, that's disappointing. And then I think I got in touch with you, and you're like, well, now it is coming out, and so that was that was a good one. It's the book's called Changing the Guard, and I think it's a great title because there has been so many changes that have happened in the army in the last 20 years. Before we get into it, before we get into your background, I just need to know something off the top of my head. Did writing this book make you angry?
It's interesting. I think often with any piece of writing, I find often that actually you're trying to scratch some kind of internal itch or to get something out of your system, to kind of, and I mean, we'll come on to a minute, but I'd had this kind of limited engagement with the army, and I kind of wanted to come back and I suppose trying to work out what had happened and what it meant. And I think there was a lot of stuff I was angry about, yeah. And I think, as we'll come to, that a real theme that runs through the book is about this idea of accountability, and how it either happened in a convolute way or did not happen at all in the post 9/11 wars. So I think yeah, there was certainly an emotional charge to it for me, but I think also when you're reporting, you do have to kind of doing it out of emotion is a potentially dangerous place as well. As I once had an interesting chat with a retired detective who said the same thing as well. But when you first get into that world, you're very driven by this idea of like nailing criminals and stuff like that. And actually, as you become more experienced, you find actually that's a potentially dangerous set of motivations to come in. You've got to follow what you have. But I think another factor about this book is because it took so long. I conceived this in 2013. I got a book deal in 2015. It took me 3 years to write, and it was meant to be published in 2019, but because of all that happened, it was 2 years later. So I'm at a different stage in my life now than I was when I wrote the book. So I'm 35 now. I was 28 when I started it. And this is a young man's book, and it has been pointed out, described as the angry young man's book. And I think there is some value in that as well, because ultimately, these wars were largely at ground level prosecuted by young people, and it was important that kind of perspective survived.
We've got so much to dig into today, but I just want to touch on that one before we go in. When hundreds of people are dying for no reason, you should be fucking angry. Like that's a worthwhile thing to be angry about. But we'll come into all that. One of the things I want to pick up on there before I forget as well is, you said about writing for a reason and trying to work something out. And we had we recorded with Simon Scarrow, the author, earlier in the week, and he wanted me to pass on to you how much he enjoyed the book.
So what's his last name?
Simon Scarrow.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with his stuff. What is
he writes Roman fiction, and he now has a series about. He now has a series about Germany, new book called Blackout.
How interesting.
Yeah,
well, that's very kind of him.
Yeah, really, really cool guy. One of my inspirations. So, I was like, well, that's praise indeed. Let's go back onto your background then, mate. Like, you've obviously, you're not just writing about the army as an outsider's perspective. You've got the insider outsider perspective. I've seen it. Cool.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that is the way to describe it. So to explain, when I was 18, I did what was then called a gap year commission or a short service limited commission. It had various names. It had run maybe for about 30 years. They stopped it for a while. They'd restarted it. And I had done, I read in the book, we'd done cadets at school, and that I suppose had been the thing that had drawn me to this, although I was quite outdoorsy. I was in the scouts and stuff. And I did this thing, and the idea was that you had to get a high pass at what it was then called RCB, but is now AOSB, so the Army Officer Selection Board. And then you did a frighteningly brief course at Sandhurst, which was the same one that Army doctors did. I mean, it was 3.5 weeks or something. It was very, very limited. And then you were thrown into the army, and you went to a regular unit, but you could not be deployed because you were sort of comically undertrained, basically. So it was a sort of weird. I think it was a wise program that the army did, and the idea was that it took people who were capable it was harder to get one of those than to get regular Santos entry. But they weren't necessarily going to come back to the army. So they might go off and work in business or in government. I think the return that they got, the idea was you would do this year, go off to university, and you could come back afterwards. But the return they got was maybe 25%. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but really relatively low. So I think the idea was that it would create a kind of cadre of people who had a bit of experience with the military, but would potentially go off and do other things. And so, I think I was quite careful in the book to state, like, my military experiences were fleeting, right? Like, I spent 9 months in the army when I was 18. I didn't go on operation. But I suppose what I realized years later was I had this snapshot of what was an interesting historical period. So this was from September 03 through to early summer of 04. And that was just after Telek 1, after the invasion of Iraq, before the Southern Afghanistan tours. I was in a tank regiment in Germany, but I realized that I had, particularly being in Germany, in some ways had seen a kind of last glimpse of the post-Cold War army. So still based in Germany, still a lot there. And then I suppose the thing that really allowed me to write the book, on the other hand, was that I was a journalist. So after I'd been at university, I kind of knew that I wanted to do journalism. I really wanted to write. That was the real driving thing that was motivating me. And I'd done a lot of student journalism when I was at university. And after I finished, I spent a year in the Middle East studying Arabic. But I then had my break. Really was I had a scholarship to go to the US. So I went to journalism school in New York at Columbia. I then worked at the New York Times, and I worked as a freelancer for Reuters and for The Economist in Africa and for Newsweek in the UK, building up particularly concentrating on writing kind of longer form magazine pieces. And when I came back, I'd been abroad for 5 years in the States, in Africa and so forth. I came back at the end of 2012. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. I turned down a couple of big journalism jobs, one in the Congo, one in West Africa. And I sadly had this kind of lingering interest in the army and in what had become of it. And I hadn't had any association with the army really over the previous 10 years. But the Afghan campaign was winding down. It was coming to an end. And I realized that I had this kind of comparative advantage and that I'd had a snapshot of how things had been. Clearly a huge amount of change, but also right from the beginning was this idea that I could write a book about the army that people who had no interest in the army might want to read. So that it was a book that was really about Britain, told through the lens of the army. And I went to Afghanistan again briefly in 2014 to do a piece for The Economist as they were packing up Bastion, and I was in Kabul as well. Saw it was very different and got a book deal on the back of that. So the idea was that I had these kind of two, like, really not pretty fleeting reference points at the time I spent in the army when I was 18, that trip in 2014, and that I would then fill out, the period in between, and would write this book that was a book about the army, but right from the beginning was, we were talking about kind of literary genres and stuff, is I wanted it to jump the fence. I wanted people who were soldiers who had an association with the army to read it, but, I wanted their mums to read it as well.
I think one of the things that lets down a lot of journalists is they only go and see the military when it's on deployment. And that's not the military. Like, that is the military on deployment. It's a very different beast to I imagine some of the things that you saw in Germany were probably quite eye-opening.
Yeah. And I think there's an interesting point about that in that, yes, very fleeting experience compared to a full military career, but compared to the access you get as a journalist, actually, I lived, in a unit, and I was there, and I spent time as orderly officer having to like rescue people from the German police and all that kind of thing. And, that kind of thing that one saw that was real. I think what is also a point, and this was came up in the book, but also in the fracas that came about it, is it is actually very hard as a journalist to get access to the British military. So the way that those relationships are governed are much more restricted, particularly than the Americans. So if you look at the big bits of reportage that have been done into the US military, like David Finkel, who wrote Thank You for Your Service, I think, or Sebastian Junger and Tim Hetherington, like, they were able to go and spend months with military units on deployment, to follow them for a long time, in a pretty unfettered way. And you can't really do that with the Brits. In general, to get access either embedded or in the UK or in barracks, you have to sign a document that gives the military authorities pre-publication oversight of what you publish in return for getting in, which is a kind of pretty Faustian deal. And I wasn't willing to do that. So the way I was able to get around it was I played by the rules for an embedded assignment in Afghanistan, but then they didn't have subsequent leverage on the book. So yeah, I think it was, and it's also very interesting how I was perceived writing it, because I was very open about what I was doing. I said I was writing this book, but clearly because of my background and stuff, people rightly or wrongly perceived I was sort of inside the tent, and that was an advantage as well.
Why do you think there's a difference between the way the US military treats the press towards the British military?
I think it's cultural, and I think it goes a lot beyond the military. So I did my journalism training in the US, and the whole kind of social position of the reporter in the US is really different. You know, if you think partly it's constitutionally protected, so they have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, although applying that First Amendment stuff to newspapers, that only really began in the 20th century. But, you know, American journalists, the way I phrase it is like, they think they're priests, right? They really think it is a really important public calling. And that's easy to mock, but actually over the years, I've really come to admire that. You know, this idea that you're going to get it right and you're going to put a huge amount of effort into getting it right. But also that America in general as a country has expanded more kind of political effort into freedom of speech questions than other countries. And I would say Britain, amongst, you know, Western democracies, is probably the most restrictive. It's just in our culture and the way that our government plays. But I suppose the argument that I make in the book is actually, you know, if you keep everything on a very close hold in terms of access to the press and stuff, it's comfortable in the short term for the army, but it's problematic long term, because ultimately that relationship between media scrutiny and any kind of institution it raises the game of the institution, I would suggest, but some people would disagree with that.
I have more questions about the media later, but for now, I just want to jump on that freedom of speech thing. It's like and I'm sure a lot of listeners would be surprised by this. You know, when I wrote Brothers in Arms, I thought because it was a memoir, I would be able to say what I thought about people. And you can't. Like, you know, the lawyers went through that manuscript and were like, you can't call this person a coward. And it's like, well, why can't I? I think he's a coward. Yeah. And that was a real eye-opener for me. I really didn't know. And I don't think unless somebody works within something like the press that you actually get to know just how, you know, restrictive, you know, things are. I have a question, mate, about the Gap Year Commission. Mm. What was it that pushed you to that in the first place? Because I always feel like I feel like there's always in every military there's always some people that have gone there almost like, and I think I'm one of these people, like a story collector. You're like, I know there's going to be great stories there. I'm going. Is that something that kind of drew you towards it?
To an extent, I think it was my rebellion in some ways, in a way that I was not really aware of at all at the time. But the context I was coming from was that I grew up in Cambridge. My father worked at the university there. My parents, you know, they were academics, and this was a completely different milieu, you know, and they were very liberal people. And in a sense, the obvious rebellion for me was to cut my hair and join the army. You know, it was kind of like I was sort of inverting that on its head a little bit. So that was a factor. I think there was also, you know, we'd had this guy who I write about at school who ran the cadet force, who was a hugely inspirational teacher of history, and he loved everything to do with the army, even though the tension I explored, he had no operational experience. He'd never been in the army or anything, and he ended up inspiring all these people who then all got sent to Afghanistan. But so I think there was an element of that. I think also, you know, I liked being outdoors. I liked climbing mountains, but I was competitive. I was a very competitive teenager, and these things were really hard to get. They were like the hard, you know, you had to get the top pass and everything like that. But what is sort of interesting as well is I was steered, as a lot of people doing that program were, you know, you're steered to a large corps, to the engineers or the artillery or the signals, because, you know, they have a lot of regiments. And if you've got like a barely trained 18-year-old who you've got to find something to do with, you know, that makes sense. And I was all set to go to artillery. And then literally the last minute, I remember being on this artillery familiarization visit at Larkhill and meeting someone who was talking about the cavalry and how kind of glamorous it was and everything like that. And I then kind of steered to that, which and I was a fraud in that environment. I mean, I have a posh voice, but I'm not, you know, from and I went to a private school, but I didn't go to a grand boarding school or anything like that. And so there was definitely, I think, in retrospect, this idea that I was that the army was allowing me to maybe like assimilate this idea of sort of, you know, grandeur that really wasn't me. So there was a bit, you know, which is whether that was rooted in insecurity or what, I don't know. But I explored that. I don't know if you saw the piece I wrote in the FT, particularly about how that, like, this idea of like the smart regiment and smart officers, part of it is about, yes, posh officers, but a lot of it is about, you know, quite middle class people pretending to be posh officers as well.
Did you ever read the Flashman books?
Yeah, I did. And I remember vividly reading Flashman and literally finding it in the school library, and then going to look up in Who Was Who to see if Flashman was real. I mean, this was my sort of slight lack of awareness. I remember that, and I remember reading Media Action by Andy McNab as well, and that having a huge thing. But I think it is that sort of Flashman thing. And in the end, what these things are a matter of timing, right? But I was then in the Scots DG in Germany, and they had literally just come back from Telek One, immediately after that time. And what then years later in the book, the beginning of the book is that story of them going to war. So it begins on a Battis exercise, and it's all that kind of gear up. But I think again, this is maybe a very writerly point, but you'll be aware of this. It's like the beginning of that book follows the sort of archetypal form of every war story you've ever seen, right? Which is like training, then combat. So if you think about like Band of Brothers or Platoon or all these Vietnam films, it's like the boot camp and then the battle. Like that is a really powerful narrative form. And I was interested to kind of take that and then sort of run with it.
Yeah. What was the decision then to go to go journalism rather than go in and taking a full-time commission for you?
I think I was never going to go back. I think that and that's not really a comment on, that I didn't like the army or things like that, but I had this really overpowering desire to write, and that had been the other factor when I was a teenager. Like I set up a magazine at school that got banned, and I was always like trying to write stuff. And that was a compulsion or an obsession. And I think also there's an interesting idea I sometimes think about the army that, what that year sort of did was kind of inoculate me to the army. Because I saw, I didn't go off and fight, but I did see what living in a barracks in Germany actually is like, and how that kind of compares with, how it's presented in a recruitment brochure or something like that. And I think there was something quite, it's quite useful about that because it broadens your mind. And, but it was very helpful. And I think, I then went and I did a degree and again was in a sort of very academic environment. And it's just, what I do now, what I think in many ways the thing that I drew most from the army was about how to talk to people, and how to talk to anyone and how, regardless of whether their background or anything is different for you. Because in what I do now, my entire job is dependent on as a journalist, my ability to talk to people. And the thing that I suppose kind of took was, you just really have to be yourself. That if you're trying to pretend to be something you're not, then pretty rapidly it's clear that that's fraudulent.
Yeah, the bullshit detectors are set to quite sensitive in the military. So, what I got to know, what did you get? Why did your school newspaper get banned?
I mean, it was totally outrageous. I mean, you talk about like it had not been lawyered. That was my school had been was in Cambridge, and it was bombed during the Second World War, and which is very rare. Cambridge wasn't really bombed, but I think a lost pilot on the way home jettisoned his load. Yeah. And the subheading was that the best thing to hit the school since the Luftwaffe, and that sort of that defined the tenor of the rest of the publication. I mean, it was and theoretically 4 people wrote it, but I actually wrote all of those. I mean, it was desperately adolescent, but I do think there is something, that I was stretching a muscle that was about writing that has been a hugely important part of my life since then.
Where did this? I'm getting the impression you're a bit like an agitator. Like, I think there's those personality types, isn't there? And I think most writers are questioners. And because it's like, when you get, and I always wonder about this, because when you're around kids are always why? But then adults don't seem to ask many questions, and I wonder why that is. Is that bred out of people? Is it because they got told so many times to shut up? What was it about you that kept asking why about everything?
It's a good question, and I think this kind of thing, I host a writing podcast as well, and we always try and ask people like, what is the thread through their work? What is making this stuff? And people are really bad at verbalizing it actually, and I find I'm not good at this as well. I think there is part of me that has always been outraged by kind of institutional deceit, by lying on an institutional scale, and one could get very Freudian about why that is from my background and stuff. But I think there has been something about that this idea of if there is a disconnect between what is being said and what has happened, then there's been a part of me always that has been wanting to like drag that into the light. And I think part of the reason I say that is that you talked earlier about anger, and I think certainly often a lot of my work has been motivated by anger, but I increasingly would say I think it's a problematic motivation set, because particularly people who are often very angry will think that they're sort of working through their anger, but they're kind of not, and usually if you're really angry about something, it's about something inside you, not necessarily not necessarily the wider world. But yeah, this agitator, I think, is possibly right. And just coming back specifically to the army, I remember, there's this scene at the beginning of the book where I go in 2013 to this book launch for this book called British Generals in Blair's Wars. It was meant to be a kind of discussion forum for senior commanders, and all these very senior guys turned up, and the atmosphere was just like, it was like a sort of reunion. It was like very clubby and everything like that. And I remember Robert Fox standing up, the guy from the Evening Standard, saying, like, guys, this is fantastical. Like, these wars have not gone well, and everyone's sort of slapping each other's backs, And there was this feeling, and certainly as I worked on the book, just like a disconnect between what had happened and then what had happened to everyone who'd been in charge.
Where does your moral code come from then? Because I totally agree with you. When I see people lying, and I know they're lying, and more to the point, I know people have died for those lies and will continue to die for those lies, that goes against a moral code. And that moral code, I believe, came from my parents, my grandparents, but also from reading. So has that been a similar kind of experience for you?
I think this idea of a code is really interesting, and I think it's really important. And I think, partly probably familial, but I think also from my professional background, that I had this opportunity to go to the US when I was in my early 20s and was really exposed to American journalism there, and particularly this like magazine writing tradition. But if I'd summarize it, I think the code, or what I try and bear in mind when you write nonfiction, is that you should write with severe compassion. So you should write with a compassion to the situations that the people you're describing find themselves in. But you should have a severity, which is like, you're not going to whitewash anything. You're not going to hide anything. And you're going to kind of try and sort of say it like it is. And, a point that's been raised by a lot of people who read the book is like, there's the book, but then there's like 100 pages of notes at the end where everyone is like disagreeing or debating, or all the like interpretation and all of the, because a huge amount of pulling anything together like this is, it's a lot of like, he says this, she says this, right? And I just wanted to have that all in there. Like, you can see it. You can see if this person disagrees with that person. You can see if there's a dispute about anything, and you can make your own judgments. And I think there is, that kind of, honesty is maybe the wrong word. I think just increasingly, and I'm a different person now than when I wrote the book in many ways. But the thing I find people respect when you're writing about them is not if you blow smoke up their arse, but if you make an extraordinary effort to get things right, and to be fair, to give people a shout. That requires experience and skill. But I think if you can go into a situation and say, look, I am going to hear you out, and I'm also going to hear the guy you disagree with out, and it's all going to be in there, and everyone's going to get a say. They may not be filled with joy with what you write, but I think hopefully people go like, fair cop.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the things you're pushing with the book is not, hey, look, this is the way it needs to be. I have all the answers, but we need to talk about what's happened so that we can learn from it, because that doesn't seem to happen, does it? Is that fair to say?
I think that's absolutely fair to say, yeah. And it's this idea that, it was just kind of extraordinary that I did the book, that this, the other thing I would say is like, this is a reported book. It's not a piece of memoir. It's piecing together these events, things that you yourself and people you will know have lived through. But I was just amazed that, it had been deleted from the kind of institutional memory, that there was no discussion about it. And I think, again, without getting all too kind of, cod sort of therapy talk about it, like the thing about the problem is not having a problem. The problem is not accepting a problem. That's the same if you've got a gambling problem or an alcohol problem or something like that, right? Like, things go wrong in any human endeavor, and particularly in something as chaotic and as difficult as war. But then, I think we have a very British tendency to pretend, it's easier not to talk about it, not to have that kind of truth. And, it's been interesting, I think, that a few people on social media have just been like, your book is the debrief. They've just called it like the debrief. And I'm kind of touched with that, and also a point, there's no bit at the end where I say like, this is what we should do, this is what is different, and I kind of felt like I was going to like lay it out, and now it's like, it's everyone's discussion now, but there's no one can say like, this didn't happen, or this wasn't there.
It's very strange because debriefing is such an integral part to the military. You go down a range, or you go pairs fire in a maneuver. What happens at the end of the range? You get debriefed on what you just did. What happens at the end of a company attack? You get debriefed on what you did. But then we go through a war, and there seems to be no debrief and lessons learned. And it seems very strange, because at every other stage in the army, that debriefing is big, is everywhere.
I think it's a really interesting point as well. And I think I've thought about since the book came out was, I think part of maybe, the anger that I did have about this was I remembered when I was having my fleeting exposure to the army as a teenager, that this idea of accountability was driven into people. Particularly at Sandhurst, it was like you carry the lives of the people under you in your hand. Now, whether a platoon sergeant would agree with that perspective on a second lieutenant, I don't know. But this idea of accountability was so central, and that there had seemed to have been no accountability at senior levels, and that made me angry. But I think part of it is because I didn't spend 3 years in the army or whatever. I think if I'd spent longer, some of that kind of slight idealistic naivety might be knocked off me. I'd have realized actually like what the mythos is and the reality is a bit different. But there wasn't really an opportunity for that. So, a lot of this, as some people have pointed out, I think correctly, this idea that when something goes wrong, there's no accountability at the top. That applies to our financial sector. It applies in politics and stuff as well. It's not a unique trope to the military. But it is a fascinating distinction, as you say, between that culture where debriefing is absolutely central and this sort of desire to forget everything.
One of the things I found interesting in your book is how it split opinion in critical reviews in papers. So there's one, and I hope you don't mind me bringing this up. But there's one review in the Telegraph that gave it 1 star, which I just found, to be honest, disgusting. For like the idea that because the person didn't agree with your conclusions, that it was a 1-star book, and this is a professional journalist writing this report in the bloody Telegraph. It spoke to me about how strongly entrenched these ideas about the British military are within the establishment, really. And I suppose the Telegraph is a establishment newspaper. And well, I suppose I have quite a few questions about this, but one of my first ones is, do you have a thick skin?
Yeah. And I think, I'd never published a book before, right? So I'm sure you've had this experience yourself, that when you I published a lot of journalism, but when you publish a book, it's qualitatively and quantitatively different. It's bigger and your emotional investment in it is bigger. And seeing your work reviewed is a very strange thing. The advice my agent gave me when this happened was like, be scrupulously polite to everyone, no matter what they say, and say it's great to have a debate. And that was just like what
that's great advice.
Which is great advice, which I thought was kind of, I think it's fortuitous I think there's a number of things that are fortuitous in that, the first people, it was all embargoed till February. The first people to like come out the gates with a review was the Army Rumour Service, ARS, who like gave it 5 stars and called it a masterpiece, right? And I think that's not going to be as widely read as a newspaper, but I felt that in a sense gave it credibility with a professional military audience, because obviously people would be like, what the fuck does he know? He only did a year in the army, all that, which is very understandable. With the split in some ways, I think I do have a relatively thick skin, but I don't think I think about this professionally as well with success or failure. It's not about making yourself like inured to difficult stuff. It's about kind of equanimity is the way I think about it. Like, particularly if you're pitching work or anything like that, the attitude I try and have is like, okay, if it works, great, but like, I still got to get up tomorrow. And like, if it doesn't work, okay, but it's not the end of the world. You're trying to maintain levelness. You're not trying to, so you can ride these things. And it's obviously it's a bit of an experience and stuff like that. But, I think I'll probably frame that Telegraph review and like put it at the lead.
You should do, mate. You should do. I thought it was just bananas. And his main argument was that and this is something we'll come on to a lot, it wasn't the general's fault, it was the politician's fault. So if you bear with me a second, I'd like to read one of Napoleon Bonaparte's maxims. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but I think this is really important.
Go ahead.
A general-in-chief has no right to shelter his mistakes in war under cover of his sovereign or of a minister when these are both distant from the scene of operation and must consequently be either ill-informed or wholly ignorant of the actual state of things. Hence it follows that every general is culpable who undertakes the execution of a plan which he considers faulty. It is his duty to represent his reasons, to insist upon a change of plan. In short, to give in his resignation rather than allow himself to be made the instrument of his army's ruin. Every general-in-chief who fights a battle in consequence of superior orders, with the certainty of losing it, is equally blamable. In this last-mentioned case, the general ought to refuse obedience, because a blind obedience is due only to a military command given by a superior present on the spot at the moment of action. Being in possession of the real state of things, the superior has it then in his power to afford the necessary explanations to the person who executes his orders. but supporting a general-in-chief to receive a position order from his sovereign, directing him to fight a battle with a further injunction to yield to his adversary and allow himself to be defeated, ought he to obey it? No. If the general should be able to comprehend the meaning or utility of such an order, he should execute it. Otherwise, he should refuse to obey it. So that would be the response I give to anybody that says generals, they were just doing what they were told by the politicians. If you were my commanding officer in Afghanistan and you told me to go and do the whole village, that is on me. And this is something we are going to talk about, but that is on me to say no. And I think this sloping shoulders is a real core part of your work, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge, and I think it's a fascinating quote. I'm not familiar with it, but it's punchy as one would expect. I think to sort of sum up that idea of it, I had a really interesting conversation with a serving army guy last week. He's a major, but the way he described it is like the British military is indemnified against operational failure because we have this narrative that you always blame the politicians. And he said that which is an interesting term. Indemnified is something you would associate with insurance or something like that, right? And his idea was that no matter how badly it went wrong, there would be a chorus of sort of loyal outriggers in the media and stuff like that who'd be literally like, it's all the politicians. I think the point that I felt, it is interesting that the lines of pushback against the book have sort of evolved as twofold. The first was, what the fuck does he know? Which I could understand where it came from, but again, when people have seen the kind of heft of it and the level of research, that seems to have gone actually, which is touching. But the second, is that it was all the politicians' fault, and I think there is validity to that in some ways that I could have explored that more in the book, but it's not. I think the other point is like that's been the entire argument for like the last 15 years. If you ask how it's discussed in the media, and I felt that that it needed to be sort of brought to the fore. And I think, there is this I wrote this op-ed for the Times about British generals appear to be unsackable. And I think that, again, a big point here is it's not really about individuals. I don't think these are bad guys or stupid guys or anything like that. How an institution behaves is about the rules of the game that are set up. And as you say, if the rule is, it's on you, then people think differently. And I think, again, the situation we have at the moment is a little bit of a kind of moral hazard situation. That idea that you can, it's like if you're a company, this idea that if no matter how much you screw up, you'll get bailed out by the state. It creates this moral vacuum as to who's accountable, and that's a problem. The more interesting and in some ways more difficult question is how do we change that culture? Because I think that's extremely difficult to do.
Yeah, and honestly, that's not something I have any answers on because the people making those decisions are aren't people that I see wanting to change. Like you said, 15 years, we've had ample time to make these changes. And the fact that if they haven't been made on the back end of 2 losing wars, what chance of them then happening in the next, before the next ones? It's just not going to happen, is it?
I think there's 2 lines. I think in some ways, absolutely. But I think there's also kind of interesting generational point, right? So I was asked to give a talk at Shrivenham to ICSC, to a group of majors there. And I said, what I would say about you guys is this is your army now. You're going to run this army over the next 20 years. You're going to decide its course. And there is an idea that, if the Afghanistan pullout was in 2014, that since then, really, the people at the top of the army they were so involved in running those campaigns at senior levels that they're just not able to have that kind of deep staring in the mirror that needs to be happening. But as a younger generation comes up who were senior NCOs and field officers in those conflicts, that they'd have more motivation to do it. The other point is they may just completely forget it, And I do think a really interesting point, and what I'd like to explore more, is what is it like to be a junior soldier now or a young officer coming through as a bunch of guys in their 30s say, pull up a sandbag and let me tell you about Herrick, or something like that. Do people just roll their eyes behind their back and go, I don't want to hear more of this? How does I don't know the answers to that, but I would be interested to.
From what I get told by my friends who are still serving, there's not many Afghan and Iraq vets left. Most of them have gone, and there's a few reasons behind that. One of the main ones is private security work. A lot of the guys, they got that. They went and did the operational tours. And then it's right, well, I can be in barracks and I can be getting treated like a kid every day, or I can go and earn 3 times the money and I can still play.
On the circuit.
Exactly. And so there was a massive, you'd call it a brain drain, I suppose, in any of the things. So that was one. And then I was actually just talking to some of the guys yesterday. Some of them are coming up, and this fucking makes me feel so old. Some of them are coming up on the 22 now. and they're not going to do their Veng because they've just had a gutful of the army.
Yeah.
And I just don't. The army has not done a good job of retaining these guys. And the other side of it is, I have a lot of friends who have tried to rejoin, guys who are Iraq veterans, guys who are Afghan veterans, and the army are like, well, yeah, you can rejoin, but you're going to go back to basic training, and you're going to come back in on a private wage. And for somebody that's, say, 30 in their early 30s, you can't survive. Yeah, you can't survive on 17 grand.
It's not viable.
So I think, and when I've been around, I've speaking to I won't say who it was, but it was someone that's very senior in the army now, and he was just saying, like, guys, there's hardly anyone in now. He said, when you do parades and stuff now, you don't see any medals. There's hardly anyone who's done anything. And that's sad, but I can see the reasons for it.
And it's also inevitable, right?
Sure.
There's a churn through that happens, and so forth.
One of the things I noticed though on the because when they did they rejigged the army, they put a big emphasis on the reserves. Like, right, we're going to increase the size of the reserves, and that's going to be what we backfill the army with. And what happened to myself and a lot of other people I know was the problem was with the people in the reserves who hadn't deployed. Every summer they were doing a 2-week promotion course and going up through the ranks. Whereas the guys that were going out and doing the fighting, they weren't doing any promotion courses because they were at war. So when you came back in the regular battalion, obviously it's top down. Like, usually your sergeants, your sergeant majors, they're the ones with the tours, and your privates are the ones without.
Yeah.
What happened in the reserves was that people come back from the tour were privates and lance corporals, and your sergeants, corps sergeants, sergeant majors had no tours.
And it turns everything inside out.
Yeah, and it just wasn't working. And I felt like I got hounded out. So did a lot of other people that I know, because you'd come across people on the circuit and you'd be like, oh, well, I was doing TA, but I left. Why did you leave? Well, because they were just making my life hell. And I think that was, I don't know if I'm not saying it's a deliberate ploy, but I feel naturally no sergeant major wants somebody to be sitting in his lesson who's done 5 tours and he hasn't done any. It just doesn't work. So
no.
I think that was a big that caused a big exodus of experience from the reserves, because there's reserve soldiers out there who have done like all kinds of punchy tours because they just bounce from one place to the next. And so I think that was a big part of it. And it's like you said, part of it is inevitable as well, that you are going to lose those people out there.
I think also it's part of it is just that war doesn't happen all the time, right? And so much of it, that makes running a military institution very difficult. I mean, if you think, how would you run a health service if you're practicing on cadavers most of the time, or how do you do that? And that's not the army's fault. But it's interesting because I did a big magazine piece a couple of years ago about mountain guides in France, and it had a lot of overlays in that. I won't bore you with the details, but they basically, in France, it's incredibly prestigious to be a mountain guide. To do it, you have to pass a kind of selection cadre to get in. But they realized that they had a real cultural problem in that French mountain guides had the worst accident rates in Europe. And essentially, the problem was that it was incredibly prestigious to be a mountain guide. So you got like real young athletes doing it, who then got the tick but had no interest in actually taking tourists up mountains. And so they would just like drag them up and everyone would get hurt and everything like that. And so they did a huge kind of cultural shift, that which is very difficult. But they're operational all the time, right? It's not, and so it's easier to keep things focused. And I think that basic point that like it doesn't happen all the time, and that no one comes in from outside. There are both, the first is unavoidable. The second, there are good reasons for, but that creates a lot of tension.
I'm glad you brought that up because you joined a unit that had just come back from war. It's important to note that is the exception.
Yeah,
most soldiers never go to war. That can lead to its own problems, because I think one of the reasons the army's struggling to recruit right now is because people
there's nothing to do.
Yeah,
there's no operation.
Yeah, exactly, and it's not like the old days where your other choice was to die in the gutter. If you can make a living doing something else, and it's the other thing as well is I'd be interested to know your thoughts on it's. The kind of people, like, I imagine some of the things that you saw in Germany like it's basically like watching a troop of like chimpanzees a lot of the time. And I'm saying that in the nicest way.
Just in the officer's
Yeah,
mess. Yeah.
I love being a chimpanzee, and I miss the chimpanzees. But what do you feel that this? It's almost like the military's always been different to civil life, right? There's always been a bit of a difference there, but it seems now that almost maybe the gulf is too big for a lot of people to join, because we are in an extremely civil society. Violence is something that, you go to prison now for throwing a punch in a pub. That's reality. And then to ask people to go from that, like that's your base layer, to go into an organization where you might go to war, is that just too big of a jump are we asking too much of a jump from civil society to the military?
I think to kind of slightly twist the question a little bit, I think there is this huge question of what level of exceptionalism does the army need? That ultimately, if its job is violence, do you have to, kind of, as you say, have the kind of caged beasts attitude? I think my feeling is that there is probably truth in that, but it can also be an excuse for other things. Because particularly if you look at like a tank crewman or someone like that, in the regiment I were with, that job is not physical. Like it's an operator's job. It's about dealing with machinery and things like that. It requires bravery, but you're not slinging punches in that kind of job. I think also, to unpick a bit of the kind of Germany stuff. I do write a book a lot about kind of people boozing and stuff like that. Is I felt that so much of the way we think about the military, as you say, is wrapped in these legends and these myths about heroism and in this indemnification that we have. And I felt that what I wanted to do in the book was for it to have a kind of rawness, so particularly that's current in the way that I wrote about casualties. Like I wanted to write about what actually happens if you get your legs blown off, and then what the next 5 years of your life are like. But also, that and this has caused a great deal of attention and I think disquiet, but like I went and interviewed the women who worked in the brothel outside the camp, right? And I spoke to them about what that was like, because I thought it was interesting, because it was clearly a big part of the culture there. It wasn't illegal, it was Germany and everything, but I felt like, isn't this kind of quite interesting? It's something that happens, and it's a sort of like, those women knew a lot about men, and they knew a lot about soldiers, and they had a sort of perspective on it. And so I felt this whole thing we were starting with is saying, like, I wanted this to be a book about the army that is different to what most books about the army are like.
Yeah, it's, everybody knows about Kenya. Anyone in the military knows about Kenya and prostitutes, and Belize and prostitutes, and Germany and prostitutes. You don't hear that outside. You don't hear about it outside of the military. And yet it's, it's, on one hand, it's like, hey, and this is what I've always said about my thing with females being in infantry units, is I have no doubt that there's women out there that can do the job. But I have a lot of doubt that the mid-infantry guys around there can separate gender from, because this is a culture of men being their most kind of base in a lot of ways, and and that's why I thought, well, the army is kidding itself here when they think that there's this enlightened attitude, because as soon as the guys go to Kenya, everyone's fucking prostitutes.
I think what is interesting to watch about, I'm sure you've seen these, but these like recent videos that have come out in the last couple of months with General Patrick Sanders talking about his experience of depression, and the Army Sergeant Major talking about them, and they're powerful things, right? Because that would be sort of unthinkable, and it wouldn't have happened. And that is about a kind of cultural change. I think there is this other quite interesting strand about, gay soldiers, right? Which from the time that I remember would have been pretty much unthinkable, I think. I'm not sure, to be kind of out in that environment, but that has shifted. So I think these things kind of can shift. But there is this, and I don't know the answer to this question, as you say, if you have an institution whose job ultimately is to fight, like how savage do they have to be? That's the kind of answer to that. And I genuinely don't know the answer to that question.
I think we've been very fortunate in a way that, like, and, this isn't to diminish what anyone went through in Afghanistan and Iraq, but we haven't had a Falkland situation, which I think was physically a lot harder. We haven't had people who have had to tab from one side of an island to the other in the freezing cold and then fucking go through minefields and beat people to death with an SLR. Like, we haven't had to do that. And I have no doubt that there's a lot of soldiers right now in the military who are capable of doing that. I have no doubt.
Yeah.
But I do think that, when they're bringing up examples like, oh, well, we've had people on the front line and, it's, well, a convoy going from Bastion to somewhere is not the front line like tabbing across the Falklands is. And I think we should always, instead of, well, what did we just get away with? We should be thinking, well, what could happen, and this isn't about a gender thing either. This is to do. I'm talking in terms of fitness standards and everything. You know, the more you lower standards, the more, you know, you are setting yourself up for failure in the future. And unfortunately, in the military, failure comes at a cost of lives. And as hard as Afghanistan and Iraq were in a lot of ways, I do think they were quite easy in a lot of ways as well. You know, they really, we weren't, you weren't hanging on to a hill like they were in Korea. You weren't, you know, fighting in jungle like they were in...
And absolute command of the air and everything like that.
Yeah, well, absolute command of the air is a massive one.
But I think just coming in on that, I had a thought on that one, which I think there's a lot of truth in what you say. The one idea that I do think sits interestingly with that is, you know, there was, if you look, I found this in my research, if you look around, say, 2005, 2004, 2006, so a lot of discussion in the British press, this idea of like a PlayStation generation was coming into the army who were soft and who wouldn't be able to cope with it. And I think that was untrue. You know, I think there is something in like unwise young people, often young men, who, you know, will step up to these things. And I think this idea that, you know, everyone is getting softer, the real pushback to that is people have said that since the beginning of history. You know, so if you read like Anthony Beevor's book Inside the British Army, which is very good, but it's about the army at the end of the 80s, you know, it's all about these like senior NCOs going, well, 1987 was when everything went wrong, you know, and you think, well, or you know, you read the Second World War. So I think, you know, this idea that I think, you know, solid things like fitness standards and stuff do matter, but the idea that people think the generation after them is soft, that's just like as old as human history.
I agree, mate. And, you know, I've heard people say, oh, you wouldn't get people in the army now going over the top. Absolute bollocks. Yes, they fucking would. One of the problems we had in Afghanistan was keeping people off the walls when a contact was happening. People wanted to get in there. And,
sure.
And to me, a team of guys sweeping for IEDs through a choke point, that is to me is the same as someone going over the top. Now, I'm not saying it's anything like the living conditions that they had to go through and anything like that, but a lot of guys went into choke points thinking, I'm going to get blown up here, and they did it anyway.
Yeah.
And I do believe that when you get a group of people together and you have a bond with each other, then people will go above and beyond for each other. One of the things, though, that I think maybe is underlooked and that you've covered is what happens when you take a bunch of these trained guys, trained killers, especially in a unit with a very high motivational, you know, kind of drive like the parachute regiment, and then you do send them into...
To go and build schools, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, in my dream world, I am a proponent in having an army and a peacekeeping force. In my dream world, that's what I believe you should have.
Right.
I think it is absolute madness to go and send the parachute regiment to build schools, like you said. And is that what you found in your work?
It's complicated. So I think, you know, I mean, Herrick 4 is the classic example of this, right? The beginning of the Afghan deployment. I think there's a couple of ways into it. Well, I think one way is to think about how the culture of a military unit survives and is propagated. So if you think 2006, 24 years after the Falklands, right? So 3 Para had been in the Falklands. So there were like a few guys left in the battalion who'd been there, but very few. But that culture had like survived. And again, like in that Beaver book, there's fascinating stuff from the late 1980s of like, you know, Goose Green Night in the parachute regiment when they like recreate every part of the battle and everyone goes around and dresses. I mean, it's quite weird, but like it become like a sort of religion, you know, that had been passed down. But it gets to a point where that's the culture, and yet no one in the unit has ever fired their gun in action. You know, that's an exaggeration. But that, I think when you get to that point, when you're like, our culture is like, you know, alley and kinetic and everything, but actually no one's ever done it. That's really dangerous, because then when you get let out of the bottle, like it's a precious thing, you know, the opportunity is a precious thing. And I think there is, you know, that I don't know if you saw the documentary on the Paras from a few years ago that they had, where it was in 2016, 2017 maybe. It was about basic recruit training in the Paras, and it had, you know, the corporals and the NCOs who were doing the training were, you know, all this stuff about close with and get close with and kill the enemy. I was trying to place their career timelines against the operational deployments of the parachute regiment and thinking, you know, is that something you've done, or is this just what you've been sort of told it's all about? And that's through no fault of those guys. But I think, yeah, you do have an issue. And a big thing that I talk about, you know, I looked at this through the way people are motivated. And the way I had it was that there were sort of formal incentives and there were informal ones. So the formal ones are things like, what do you have to do to promote? Or I look in detail in medals. What do you have to do to get a medal? And the informal ones, I would suggest to like, what do you have to do to look cool? And people would sort of, the pushback against that would be, well, that's not what decides how an institution works. But if you think that the army is predominantly composed of young men between the ages of 16 and 28 or something like that. They really care what it means to look cool, and the idea of this kind of culture of Ali and stuff like that, and how that became a shaping force of behavior. I really tried to unpack that because I felt that was a discussion that outside the military had not happened so much.
I was speaking with one of the lads the other day. He's a very experienced guy, a rifles guy, Telic 10, Herrick, all that. And we were both being honest, and we both said, like, I would have been gutted to have not killed someone on tour. I would have been fucking gutted.
Right.
In Iraq, I didn't fire my weapon. I was in and out the back of the warrior looking for ideas, and I never fired my weapon. And I'm so glad that Afghanistan happened, because I would have struggled to have married that up with my idea of what a soldier was. And, my regiment, we have Rorke's Drift Day. We have Rorke's Drift Company. Now, if we were fighting against the Russian hordes, that's probably a great mentality to have. That fight to the death, tooth and nail. But when you're soft tap patrolling, or well, not soft tap patrolling because that never happened by the time we got there. But if you're trying to make friends in an Afghan village, the Rorke's Drift mentality probably isn't the right, mentality to have. And I don't think that the army has shifted because look, if you are fighting the battles that were fought in the Second World War or Korea or the Falklands, you want the mentality of Waterloo. You want the mentality of Gallipoli and all that. You need that.
Yeah.
But if our mission is going to be Kosovo's, if it's going to be rebuilding, then it's just not the right mentality to have. I don't think.
So I think you're right. I think it's really problematic. But there is this big question of did it work in Ireland? Through all that time. I watched a documentary about, it was like a film from 1985, I think, the Royal Anglians in Ireland, and it looked pretty grim, to be honest. A lot of stagging on and patrolling, and at the end, no one in the battalion fired their rifle or anything like that. And that, I think, was pretty normal, and that went on for years and years. But it is, as you say, how do you I just think this idea that if you maintain a culture that the absolute pinnacle of what we do is smashing things and blowing things up and all of that, that's fine if that is what you're going to go and do. But if it's not, you're creating a tension point. And then, that become black men and stuff like that. I mean, I explored that in the book.
You mentioned medals, right? So I'd like your opinion on this, because I have a big issue with medals, because I really believe that they are politicized. So, for instance, when we were in Iraq in 2007, you know yourself how kinetic those operations were.
And unreported as well, right? I mean,
Well, exactly. And then 2006, what two Lancs went through at the old state building and in the city, and not just two Lancs, there was other units there too, but two Lancs in particular. And then at the same time, you had in Helmand province, you had the 3 para battle group, and then the Marines after them. It seemed to be, when I was looking at the awards lists coming out, in Afghanistan, military cross, MID. In our battle group, for Telic 10, considering how much of we were the maneuver support battle group, we had one guy out the entire battalion get a MC.
Yeah.
There wasn't any MIDs that I can remember. I think we had one MC for the entire battle group. The rifles got a couple more, but compared to what was being given in Afghanistan, it was nothing. And my thoughts now were that, well, if you start, there was a push to be, hey, look, Afghanistan is this shooting war that everybody can understand. It's Taliban, nasty guys, British Army, good guys. Everybody's shooting. It's not nasty IEDs.
Yeah.
Right. And then it was just this thing in Iraq of, just sweep everything under the rug. And I have friends who led convoys in Iraq who have been blown up over 20 times, and they have no official.
Were these on resupply operations?
It was on resupply operations, and it was on strike operations. So I would say, my company, 3 platoon from my company, I was in 2 platoon. They led the entire battle group for most of the tour, and my platoon sergeant from Afghanistan. In Iraq, he got hit 20 times. His vehicle got hit by IEDs, but he kept going out.
Yeah.
Now, to me, that guy deserves a military cross for continuously putting himself in front of his blokes. But there was nothing, not even an MID.
I think there's a couple of points that I think on that. I think firstly, I would agree with you. While I was doing my reporting, was kind of staggered at how violent the end of Iraq was. I didn't know that. I lived, I was at university when this was happening and stuff. But yeah, reading about these sort of epic resupply missions where people had to fight their way through, that none of that kind of permeated into the public consciousness. So I think that there is a discrepancy with that. I think maybe with the medals, there's a couple of points. I think it's worth just kind of explaining how they work, because I didn't know this, like how the system works that gives medals. There clearly needs to be a system for this, but what I just tried to do a bit was show how this works. So, like, the citation gets written at subunit command generally, so by a company commander or a squadron commander. It then goes to battle group, where it gets kind of fiddled with, and I showed this in detail in the case of the PWRR in 2004. But the interesting thing with them is they were like a regiment with a relatively low profile. They'd been created in an amalgamation, and they just really went for it. They wrote up everyone they could, and then they had this battle with brigade. This is the Johnson Bahari VC, but the first step with a VC is you need to get a 2-page citation. So for everything else, it's only 1 page, but you need 2 pages for the VC. So the first step is to persuade brigade to give you 2 pages. I mean, it's extraordinary what it comes down to. So they got 2 pages, and then the adjutant rewrote it to make it more like a commando comic. It then goes to brigade, they sort of sort it. It then goes to division, it goes to PDHQ, and it finally comes to London. But then there's a quota. That's the thing that people, I think, don't quite understand, that it's quoted roughly based on casualties. But I don't know whether the quota was deliberately diminished. But I think what's fascinating is how much it depended on how much people bothered to sit down and write up their soldiers and everything like that.
So the reason I think it was deliberately suppressed is there's a period of Iraq which was more dangerous than Afghanistan at the time. The casualties were actually higher, and it just wasn't reported. And this is where I do think that that there's foul play. Are you familiar with Easy Company and Musakala, with the withdrawal from Musakala with Free Para?
Yeah, in 2006.
So
this is the Royal Irish who got no rewards.
Exactly, Royal Irish a composite company of Free Para and Royal Irish, commanded by Major Adam Jowett, who's an absolute gleaming bloke. He wrote up a lot of people. They put it through, and they got nothing, not a single, nothing for the entire company, where all the other companies were military crosses, MIDs, and what was and then there might have, hey, look, I don't know. There could be another reason, but when every other company is getting awards and the one company where there was a deal made with the Taliban and they had to leave doesn't get any awards, I'm Occam's razor on this one. I'm like, it's probably because...
What I don't know, and an interesting question is did that citation package then have to go through the 3 Para Battle Group HQ? Because if, I
imagine so.
I don't know the answer to that, but if that would have been... I genuinely don't know either way, but it could have been possible that it was sort of set up that way. But I think the point is as well that it established a precedent for what these tours were like. As you say, you went to Afghanistan, it was a shooting war, and you got medals, and so the kind of incentive to go and do that was vast afterwards.
Yeah, and my issue with the medals is because the medals is a tough one as well because it is so subjective, but I do believe as well is. People get rewarded because I think it's people can understand a shooting war and they can understand, oh, well, if there's bullets flying, it must be really difficult to stand up and charge through those bullets. So you get somebody who maybe stood up and charged through some bullets and rescued somebody, and they get their just rewards, and it is a just reward. But then there's other people, and I know some of them from my company, who found IED after IED after IED, and they did that continuously. But they never ran through bullets. And so there's no recognition where actually what they did was probably as equally, if not more dangerous. And I don't feel like we moved with IEDs. I don't feel like we moved with the times and recognized, because we recognize it for bomb disposal experts, but we don't recognize it for the 18-year-old private soldier who's swinging a Valin and on his belt buckle every day for 6 months, finding IED after IED after IED. And as you know, with command wire IEDs, and this unfortunately happened to some of our guys in Iraq, it doesn't matter how good you are. If they're waiting for you with a command wire IED, you're done. Yeah. And that to me takes just as much, and I've done both, so I can say both. It takes just as much courage to look for an IED as it does to stand up into that kind of fire. And at the end of the day, I don't think that most people really care, because I think once you've been in, you understand that medals aren't that, but there are some guys out there I would have liked to have seen recognised for it, and I'm sure people listening would say the same kind of thing. And
I mean, I think an interesting thing about medals as well is that they're incredibly meaningful, but they're just a gold star, right? This is like, there's no money attached to them or anything like that. And it's a kind of interesting argument that they fit into this broader idea of like, how do you motivate people when you can't pay them more? That's the
Yes.
army is public sector. You can't give people a big financial bonus or anything like that. And so with what I just wanted to do with the medals was say, like, this is how it worked or didn't work. This is how the system tried to do it. And again, as you're doing, draw your own conclusions from it.
How about this then with because I imagine this works the honours list works as a separate list, because it always seemed to me, and this just might be angry, grumpy Lance Corporal talking, right? But it always seemed to me that if you turn up with a battalion and you're the CO, if you don't fuck up, you're probably going to get an MBE at the end of it. But again, if you turn up as a soldier and you don't fuck up, you're just going to get your tour medal. It seemed to me that this is maybe where the class thing, I feel, kind of creeps in a little bit.
I don't know so much about a lieutenant colonel. I think definitely higher up. So if and this is documented, but if you look at the people who ran Task Force Helmand, the brigadiers and stuff, it was kind of everyone gets a medal that it went through, and I think that is really problematic. And I think class, I wrote a lot about class in the army. And I think, in some ways it is the kind of original sin of the institution. There's a kind of couple of points that I think, there's the point that it's, there's a lot of officers claiming to be posher than they are. I think that's part of the fact. I think there's also, the question in some ways about that is that I don't think the British Army has really worked out what an officer is. Like, why, what actually is it? Why do we have them? And there is the answer that what all militaries do and things, and we've always had them, which are both good answers, but they kind of sidestep the point a little bit. And I think my understanding of it is that if you look back historically, like at least as far as the 1980s, the army has said it's not about class, it's about excellence or leadership or whatever. But the way they did that was not to sort of accept it's not about class, but to try and at Sandhurst establish this kind of replication factory for like people wearing red cords and things like that, to like create a sort of cookie cutter mold of what an officer should look like and define people to that. So I think it's I think there is an argument. There is interesting discussions going on today about like, should there be messes? Like, is that a sensible way to do it? Should people eat together? Whether that kind of change has any prospect of happening, I don't know. But yeah, class is a thing in the army. I think it is.
I really like the idea of the sparser messes where they had the older, you'd have a mess where people would be there from different ages. So you get your younger Spartan soldiers or warriors, whatever you call them.
Yeah.
And then and then they'd sit together and they'd eat together. But it wasn't like you didn't have all the junior ranks sitting together in their mess.
Yeah.
All the officers. And it was this idea of you'd sit there, no kind of rank, and there's different ideas and different perspectives get passed around. I feel like I'm not saying that that's a practical thing for day to day, but I just in general, I feel like that's there's a lot to be said for that, I think.
I saw some discussion about this on social media. I mean, someone, interestingly, on terms of the reaction, said, like, should we abolish messes? ? And obviously people piled on and were like, this is the literal end of the British Army. But the point he made was, the time that units feel tightest and most bonded is when they're on operations, when they eat together, when they do things together, like with that. But interesting, the other point, and you would know more about this than I would be that there were officers saying we should abolish messes, and there were junior ranks saying we can't imagine anything worse than having to like eat with our officers or anything like that, So I think it is a complicated one.
If I commanded the regiment, it would be something that I made a once a week thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Where and because I do think it's something that because I was very lucky. I had great relationships with my officers, and I think that I was lucky in the fact that I spent most of my career on operations.
Yeah.
So we had the thing of. We had a great platoon commander who would come and sit in with the junior NCOs. We'd eat together, we'd talk, we'd take the piss out of each other. But then when his boss hat was on, he was the boss.
Yeah.
And I think with professionals, which is what the army is, I don't think we're not talking about, right, you're going to prison or you're going to the army. It's not like the days where you had to flog people and, we had the sharp days. I think now with a professional army, you should be able to have that distinction between we're talking to the boss as a human being. Now the boss is the boss. And I feel like it makes the bond stronger. I feel like it makes you feel more appreciated. It feels like your input's taken more seriously, that they care about you. I think there's a lot to be said for it, and I also think there's a lot to be said for the same way as in a relationship, a guy should be able to go off with the boys and not have the missus come along because then you can't talk about her. I think that you need that as well. Right, I think there's a happy medium. So let me ask you this, Simon: how many generals do we have in the British Army that you came across that were from council estates?
None. I think. It's an interesting question. I mean, there's that classic, the classic First World War example, right, of William Robertson, who was a commissioned warrant officer who was chief of the Imperial General Staff. But I think none. And could you? What the official response now would be what? That if you're like a bright young private soldier, you'd be selected to go to Sandhurst when you were 24, and then you'd go and then you could do it. But the reality is what? That then you'd be late off all the promotion curves, that you would be moved away from the infantry to some corps cap badge where your promotion prospects would be less. But I think, Frank is the authority on this, but the British Army is lavishly equipped with senior officers, right? There's just a lot of them. And again, that is sort of a bit shocking, but it is in some ways more useful to try and peer that back, why that happened. And I think a big part of it is like, being in an institution that is shrinking is really hard for people. They feel like, well, the previous generation had these things and all of that. But I think there's a class thing, but also I think there is also this profound sense of a kind of club. It is a club at the top. It's ruthlessly competitive, absolutely ruthlessly competitive, whether it is competitive on the right reasons. But there is a club and a sort of collective self-defense mechanism that happens there. But you're absolutely right. I don't think there are any officers in the British, any generals in the British Army.
You mentioned club. One of the things I picked up on in someone's, when he was being snidey about you in a review, was that you'd picked up on the fact that you were interviewing one of these generals in one of the poshest clubs in London, and he discounted that like it's not important. And I thought, well, actually, that is important. Because I guarantee you, any private soldiers you were interviewing for the book were not in the poshest club in London, and I think it speaks to that to me is a combat indicator of that these people do frequent these clubs, and it's a different world. Like I would say I feel like I'm quite worldly in a lot of things. I have access to a lot of different worlds. The posh club of London world is not something I have access to, and I'm a middle class student with a university degree, and I feel like it's very relevant to the conversation.
I took a lot of flack for that, and it's in the last section of the book, which most of the book is I'm not there. Like, it's third person. I'm there in the introduction, I'm in the after bit, but I talked about the experience of doing it and of interviewing these guys. I made a couple of points. Like, I had to go to quite a lot of palaces to do these interviews, because these guys there is a tradition that you go and become warden of the House of Commons, or you live in Kensington Palace, and there's a long tradition of that, but it did sit a bit askance with, you were Chief of Joint Operations during the greatest British military disaster possibly since Suez, and then you end up in a palace. Like, I found that a bit weird. But there was also this point that I made about the kind of what it does to you to be in the army for a very long time. How you are as a human being, as an individual, and the way there was a defined set of rituals about speech and dress and everything like that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but to pretend it doesn't exist is false.
Yeah, I think it doesn't mean that a general can't be a great general because he goes to a club in London, but we need to understand that there is this class difference. My thing that I always say is, if Alexander the Great got reborn right now in Oldham, he's not going to be a general.
Yeah.
And to me, I want the best army that we can possibly have. And that means that no matter where you're born, no matter who your family is, no matter what school you go to, the highest ranks of the army should be available to you.
I think there's firstly a lot of merit in that. I also think it's worth, one thing I have to think about when people say, what should the army do differently, is like plotting, reforms that are likely to happen versus reforms that should happen. And, some big things, are so dramatic it would probably never happen. But if you were doing it from scratch, if you're setting the whole thing up from scratch, I think there's an argument to say, everyone goes in at the same level, that there's a sort of period, I don't know, what is it, 6 months, a year, that everyone is at literally doing the same thing, the same kind of basic training, and that officer selection is made on the back of that. Now, the arguments that would be put the other way for that would be, well, you want, the army needs like the brightest and the best in society. Why are they going to enter at the same level that someone straight out of school can? But I think if you make the argument of like, everyone has to do this, like you can then, you can be fast tracked after that, whatever, but there is a commonality of basic experience, then, that is that would be an improvement. I had a very interesting email from a former guards officer, relatively senior guy who left. He said, like, I agree absolutely with 85% of your book, but I think the army is much more egalitarian than you've said, and also that, you know, there are good people at every rank. And I think that's truth in the last one. But I haven't replied to him yet. But I wanted to say, like, you know, in your former regiment, I won't name which one, but in a guards battalion, if you are a bright and capable guardsman who, as you say, has come up from the ranks, you know, what could you end up commanding that regiment? Like, could that literally happen? You know, I think probably not.
On paper, perhaps. In reality, absolutely no. No chance. I want, like I said, I want the best army possible, and I just feel like the best army possible, like, doesn't. I know guys who are, you know, when you hear about the upbringing that some of these guys had, like, the shit beaten out of them by their parents, you know, never this.
I was reading an interview with you before this where you're saying, you know, that you coming from, as you say, like a relatively sort of, you know, stable, like, middle class background, like two guys in your platoon, their mums had been murdered, right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, fuck, you know, but they didn't get the same shot at the beginning of life.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they shouldn't get the same shot at the army. Like, I know guys who have no GCSEs who would have made brilliant company commanders.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they should go on and become, you know, they should become, because the thing is, they'll talk about, well, there's this officer who came from the ranks. Yeah, but he never held a job like company commander.
Yeah, it's not what you
know,
do,
it's
right?
it's QM and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, if you miss those promotion boards at certain times in your life, and I just think, like, well, do we want the best army or do we want a club? You know.
So I think there's a really interesting point. I wrote a piece last week about leadership in the British Army. I was asked to do it, and a point I raised is about the discrepancy between central officer selection, so AOSB, and regimental selection from Sandhurst. So AOSB is, I think, pretty fair, actually. Like, there are I mean, I certainly know when I was at school, like, I don't think Army officer career advisors went to state schools. You know, that is clearly pretty outrageous. But, you know, actually the way AOSB is run, you know, they borrowed the system from the Germans in the Second World War. They've refined it since. You know, it's the grandfather of every corporate assessment centre ever done. It is pretty rigorous and pretty fair. But that only gets you to Sandhurst. And then from Sandhurst, regimental selection is like another story entirely. You know, it matters who you know. It's all like very hidden. And it also, it really matters because there's this huge, as you will know, this huge like internal prestige hierarchy between different bits of the army. And it's also like secret. It's not only about like, where did you go to school or whatever, but it's like, if you rock up at Sandhurst knowing nothing about the army, you know, you are at a profound disadvantage because you don't know how the game is played, like in terms of getting how things happen.
I wanted to be an officer at first, and I talked to my great uncle who started as a private, and he was in the war, so he filled a lot of dead men's shoes, and he did end up as a colonel. He goes, "Have you spoken to the regimental secretary?" I said, "What?" "No, I've been to the careers office." He said, "You need to speak to the regimental secretary." "What's that?" Now, if I hadn't have known from my uncle about that, I never would have known that the path to becoming an officer was through regimental secretary. And, you know, so like you said, there's these back doors. Before we finish, mate, I really want to touch on Marine A, because I think you've gone into him in a depth that I don't think has been gone into in other work, and I think it's really kind of important. And I think it highlights a lot of leadership issues. One, I think it highlights the sloping shoulders, and I also think it highlights the way that we went on these tours with no clear strategy, one, strategically, and two, on a battle group level. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so I read extensively about Marine A in the last section of the book, which is called Blame Game, and it's about accountability. And there's been some pushback on people going, well, he's not in the army, you know, it was a Marine and stuff like that. I mean, I state that in the book, but I think it's kind of relevant. And I initially came to this, it wasn't something I'd followed particularly closely when it all happened, but I came to it initially with a slightly different idea, which I was interested in writing about the position of the army in British domestic life, like what the army meant at home. And I saw that the day that the Marine A incident happened, when he shot a wounded Taliban fighter and was filmed by it in 2011, was the same day that Cheryl Cole of Girls Aloud was making this flag-waving visit to Camp Bastia. And I had this idea that I could write a parallel account of these two events, which happened, 15 kilometres apart? I mean, they're in completely different worlds. And you would have this one story that was about this very gritty incident on the ground, and the other was basically about the kind of UK celebrity complex arriving and how those paths crossed. And this proved completely impossible because Cheryl Cole's visit to Camp Bastion is the most closely guarded secret in the entire like post 9/11 period. Like no one would discuss it. But as reporting happens, it became a different thing. And what I found was, which is interesting, was that a lot of what I found existed in court documents, it existed in public records and stuff, but it had not been pieced together. And so the overwhelming narrative that was presented when this all came out was it was a single bad apple. It was a lone bad apple. And what I was able to show was actually it was a much broader situation, and that Blackman, who was in 4-2 Commando, there were these two Royal Marine battle groups next to each other, 4-2 Commando and 4-5, and they were taking extremely different approaches. So that 4-5 was doing kind of softly counterinsurgency stuff, and 4-2 were much more kinetic. And that several times during that tour, the commander of 4-5 had warned the brigadier about what 4-2 were doing and had been ignored. And what really kind of rendered it striking to me was, everyone knew that where Blackman was, they were getting blown up, people getting killed. It was very gritty. But then I was told by someone who was like 600 meters away, we passed our entire tour without firing our rifle in anger, and we didn't find any IDs. And you suddenly think, there's a whole debate about how different the ground was, but hang on, something is happening here. And then the situation that the commanding officer of 4-5 had repeatedly warned the brigadier had been ignored. And then the kind of staggering thing was that there was a requirement for a troop reduction. So they reduced numbers. They put then the rifle companies of 4-2 under the command of 4-5. So literally days before the incident happened, Blackman ended up on the books of the commanding officer who'd done the completely different approach. And he then ended up resigning in protest because he wasn't boarded into a court-martial. And then everyone who was in the chain of command above Blackman got promoted right up to the brigadier and everything like that. So I think what I wanted to do again was I wasn't saying he's innocent or he's guilty. I was just trying to say what happened and to lift the lid on the nuances of it.
The Marine Aid case for me is it opens a real kind of interesting question on morality and on morality of war, because nobody had a drama with the fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't he brassed up by a Apache, the wounded guy?
Yeah, he was.
So no one has an issue with the fact that this Apache, which was out of range to him, smashes him apart with a chain gun. To expand that to the rest of the conflict, no one has an issue with dropping, as you said before, we had total air superiority in Afghanistan. So to me, dropping a bomb onto a compound of Taliban is the equivalent of putting a gun next to someone's head and pulling the trigger on a wounded one. They have no chance of doing anything about it. The Taliban in a compound can't do anything about that JDAM that's about to come down on them. Now, I'd like to state for the record that I do not agree with shooting prisoners, and I do not agree with shooting wounded prisoners. But I did find it so interesting that I'm like, no one gives a fuck that the Apache shot him, but because he's up close and personal all of a sudden, then it's this terrible thing. And I think to me that was this to me was the case where, because I had these thoughts all the time about Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm like, well, hang on, nobody cares about that we're killing all these people all the time until it's up close and personal. Then all of a sudden, somehow it's a big issue. What's your kind of thoughts on that?
This is only a line in the book, but I have this line that, the reason in some ways that military accountability is so complicated is you put to one side, under certain contexts, but not all the time, this idea of thou shalt not kill, which is the sort of central foundation of a lot of civilian law. Once you put that to one side, as you say, you are in difficult and disputed territory. And it's certainly true that it's more nuanced than that. There is this point, I think, that if I would need to check with this, but if Blackman had shot him from a distance because they suspected he was armed, that would not have been questioned, but it was close. So I think, there's that question about individual morality. I think, though, nuance on this. So again, the response was very generational, broadly. There were a lot of kind of old and bold saying, this is terrible, he should have been, this has always happened in war. Younger people saying, well, what he did was terrible. My impression is, I think what he did probably happened a lot more. I think this was far from the only episode in time that it did happen, and that it was, it was filmed. But the fact that it was filmed and the language that was said about it, I mean, the whole way it came, I don't know if you know the way it came to light, but that clip, he didn't know the guy had a head camera on. The clip was filmed, it bounced around people's laptops, and then there was a completely unconnected inquiry, which was because there was a divorce going on, and a Marine's wife or ex-wife claimed that a guy had either animal or child pornography on a computer, and they went in search of that and found the clip. So I think, I think there is sort of complexity to it, but the point I was trying to make is like, this is connected. This is not just about one man, that it is much broader, and it is connected with chain of command and with doctrine and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a real tough one, mate, because again, I feel for the guys who are in that position, losing mates and the stories about limbs being hung up from trees and all of that. And I feel for them. At the same time, my thoughts on it were, look, you've been caught on camera.
It's quite open and shut in that case.
Yeah, you've been caught on camera, and also you've had time to. You can't say that you were in the battle madness when you've got time.
It was premeditated. There are four.
Yeah, and you've come up with this alley line before you shoot the guy. I mean, like that. I'm sorry, but I consider myself a professional soldier. I don't feel like that was a professional act. But I get very angry at the generals and politicians who are throwing the guy under a bus when I'm like, well, you've killed people on a much higher scale, but it's the sale of the sky. But I'm not going to go down my Tony Blair rabbit hole at the moment.
Again, just to sort of lay it out, in that, so Oliver Lee, who resigned in protest, and he wasn't brought in. But yeah, Blackman's company commander was promoted. His the commanding officer was promoted 3 times. Is now Major General. The brigadier was promoted, became a Lieutenant General. So that kind of there was no higher accountability. But I think what is interesting, I don't know if you saw the excerpt from GQ, but that brought in some of the newer staff. Is there was this report called Telemeter that the Marines did, a big report into it, which was using human factors analysis, which is a kind of way that people investigate plane crashes originally, but looking at the circumstances that lead up to something. And that was kept, the executive summary of that was published, but the main report was kept on incredibly close hold with inside the Navy. And the point of comparison, I think, with that is what the Australians did with the Brereton report, where they disbanded a squadron of the SAS, right? I mean, they did it. But it circles round to this idea we were discussing earlier of, as you say, you have an elite force, who have this idea of what they do is storm hills in the Falklands or whatever. And that's what they want to go and do. And then changing the direction of that supertanker is difficult.
Yeah, and again, let's be quite honest about this. There was plenty of stories about Argentinian prisoners being shot and killed and clubbed, and
well, they're not just stories. I mean, there are confirmed examples of it.
Yeah, and so that's what you kind of get brought up on, mate. Well, to finish up, I'd love to know, like, what do you hope will come of this book, short term? In terms of for your career, and what you have coming next, and what you hope will come of the publication.
I think I hope it'll make a discussion. That's what we were talking about at the beginning. That it will bring this stuff into the open. I don't have the answers to this, not all of them certainly, but I do feel that the situation we had before, when none of this stuff was being discussed, was problematic, and my hope is that this book will do that. I also hope that it will be meaningful for people, and actually the most touching element really since it's come out is just the letters I've got from randomers, and I've never met them before, but soldiers saying, like, I was there, this accords with my experience, like this rings true, this ring, and that is very meaningful to me. In terms of my own career, I think we also mentioned this at the beginning a bit, that often I find when I'm writing something, like, it's trying to get something out of my system. I don't think I'm going to write another book about the army, probably. Actually, I don't want to become like the guy who reviewed my book for the Telegraph. I have other.
Yeah.
I sort of feel that there's. So actually, the next book I'm doing, I'm working on a proposal for, about mountaineering, and I've got interest in writing fiction and stuff like that. So I feel I'm doing a profile of the French Foreign Legion, which should be interesting, but that's all been delayed. I should be going out with them next year, which should be very interesting. But I feel, I want to do different projects, and I don't want to have to go through again what I went through with this book in some ways.
Well, mate, you have my gratitude for writing this book, because I do think it is an important discussion. I think you and Frank had done great work in getting this out there, and I really hope that everyone listening will pick up a copy and check it out. And I want to thank you for your time today, mate. It's been a great chat. It's flown by.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Much appreciated.
Cheers, Simon. Thanks very much, mate. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thanks, cheers.
You told me not to worry, and you wouldn't break my heart. You told me you were sorry, yeah, my whole world fell apart. You said it's not my fault, and yeah, I've never done you wrong. I'm grinding to a halt, now I can see you're moving on. I promised I'd get better, and I told you things would change. You keep me to the gutter, yeah, yeah, I'll never be the same. I've gotta let you go, now live your life and spread your wings. And yeah, you put on quite a show and pulled the puppet strings. And are you sure that you don't want me? Remember all the pain, or maybe you should thank me. It's your loss and my gain. I'm leaving now forever, I won't hang my head in shame. But yeah, you've taken me for granted, and you should feel ashamed. You sold a dream to all of us, a dream that we'd all die for, a reason for us all to live and something we could fight for. I might just help a man up to his feet or hold a newborn, but no matter what I do, my hands remembering my rifle, yeah.
Life's hard, I know that, still wouldn't change shit. I wouldn't go back, yeah, I wouldn't go back. Feelings I hold back, memories fade, yeah, they go fast, yeah, they go fast. Good times to come and go, survive the highs and lows, just take it step by step, I guess, yeah, I suppose. Good times to come and go, survive the highs and lows, just take it step by step.